Call that changed everything. Major Albert Nicholson pressed his back against the concrete barrier, rain mixing with sweat on his weathered face. The compound in Kandahar was supposed to be routine surveillance, 3 days of monitoring Taliban movement patterns. His team of 6 had been executing black operations for 12 years, and Albert had earned his reputation as a man who never left anyone behind. His satellite phone buzzed against his chest. Only 3 people had this number: his commanding officer, his handler, and Hartford General Hospital, the last being a precaution he'd set up when his son Kyle was born 6 years ago. "Nicholson here," he whispered into the device. "Major, this is Dr. Sarah Chun at Hartford General. We have your son Kyle in critical condition. Sir, we need you to understand. He was found locked in a storage shed behind your residence. 4 days without water, severe dehydration, and..." The doctor's voice cracked. "Sir, there are signs of deliberate neglect." Albert's world tilted. His mind, trained to process information under extreme stress, began cataloging details with mechanical precision. Kyle, 6 years old, loved dinosaurs, called him Hero Daddy in their video calls. "Where's my wife?" His voice was steady, betraying none of the Arctic rage building in his chest. "She's here, sir." There was an altercation when the paramedics arrived. She said some things about the situation being your fault for not paying enough attention to what matters. In the background, Albert heard a voice he'd once whispered love to, now screaming. "Should have been longer. Tell his Hero Daddy to pay up if he wants his precious boy to eat." The satellite phone shattered in Albert's grip. Sergeant Tomas Whalen, his second-in-command and closest friend for 8 years, noticed the change immediately. Albert's pale green eyes had gone from focused to predatory. It was a look Tomas had seen before, right before Albert had single-handedly eliminated an entire terrorist cell that had tortured civilians. "Boss," Tomas approached carefully. "Everything okay back home?" Albert stood slowly, his 6'3" frame unfolding like a weapon being assembled. "My son is dying because my wife locked him in a shed without water for 4 days." The other team members, Carlos Merrill, Kyle Dunn, Gary Hudson, and Nick Cooley, stopped their equipment checks. These men had fought beside Albert through hell itself, but they'd never seen this expression on his face. Extraction. Now, Albert's voice carried the kind of authority that moved mountains. "Tomas, call an emergency transport. I don't care if we have to abort the mission. I don't care if we have to start World War III. Get me home in 12 hours. What Albert didn't say, what he couldn't say in front of his team, was that his wife Mercedes Nicholson had just declared war on the wrong soldier. She didn't know that Albert Nicholson was a man who had spent 12 years perfecting the art of making people disappear, both enemies and problems. She didn't know that betrayal was the one sin he never forgave, never forgot, never let go unpunished. As the helicopter lifted off into the Afghan night, Albert began planning. Mercedes thought she knew her husband, the man who sent flowers on anniversaries, who video called every night to read Kyle bedtime stories, who deposited his military pay into their joint account without question. She was about to meet the other Albert Nicholson, the one who had earned his code name Reaper by being the last thing his enemies ever saw. The flight to Germany would take 4 hours. The flight from Germany to Hartford would take 8. That gave Albert 12 hours to transform from loving husband and father into something else entirely. By the time his boots touched American soil, Major Albert Nicholson would be dead. In his place would stand a man with no moral boundaries, no legal constraints, and no mercy for those who had harmed his son. Mercedes Nicholson had no idea that she had just triggered the most dangerous enemy she would ever face. But she was about to learn. Chapter 2. Revelations and Reconnaissance. Hartford General Hospital's ICU wing buzzed with controlled chaos. Albert had arrived 16 hours after the call, having moved heaven and earth to get emergency transport. His son Kyle lay unconscious, tubes and wires monitoring vitals that should never be this weak in a 6-year-old body. Dr. Chun met Albert at Kyle's bedside. "Major Nicholson? I'm Dr. Chun. Kyle is stable now, but it was touch and go for the first few hours. Severe dehydration, malnutrition suggesting this wasn't the first time, and she hesitated. There are old bruises, consistent with being grabbed forcefully. Albert's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Prognosis? Full recovery, physically. Emotionally, he keeps asking if he was bad. If that's why Mommy put him in the dark place. The words hit Albert like shrapnel. He reached down and gently touched his son's hand. Kyle's eyes fluttered open, bright blue like his father's, but now holding shadows no child should carry. Daddy, Kyle's voice was barely a whisper. I wasn't bad. I promise I wasn't bad. I know, buddy. I know you weren't bad. Albert had to force the words past the fury threatening to consume him. Daddy's here now. Nobody's going to hurt you again. After Kyle fell back asleep, Albert found Mercedes in the hospital cafeteria. She sat across from a man Albert didn't recognize, tall, dark-haired, wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit with Wayland's Auto Repair embroidered on the chest. The surname made Albert's blood freeze. Tomas Wayland was his best friend, his brother-in-arms. This had to be a relative. Albert approached their table with the silent stride that had made him legendary in special operations. Mercedes looked up, and for a split second, fear flashed across her face before being replaced by defiance. Albert, you finally decided to show up. Her voice carried practiced venom. This is Ricky Wayland, Tomas's cousin. We've been getting to know each other while you've been playing soldier. Ricky Wayland looked uncomfortable but didn't back down. Look, man, I didn't know you were. Mary. Albert's voice was conversational, almost friendly. With a 6-year-old son who was dying upstairs while you were what? Getting to know my wife? Mercedes stood up, her 5'6" frame dwarfed by Albert's presence. Don't you dare judge me, Albert. You left us. You chose your precious missions over your family. Ricky was here when you weren't. How long? Albert asked simply. What? Mercedes seemed thrown by the direct question. How long have you been sleeping with Tomas's cousin while I've been deployed? Ricky shifted uncomfortably. Man, this is between you and... Albert's gaze shifted to him, and Ricky's words died. Anyone who knew Albert well would recognize this look. It was the same expression he wore right before eliminating high-value targets. 18 months, Mercedes said defiantly. 18 months of not being alone. 18 months of someone actually being here for me. And Kyle? How long has this been going on with Kyle? What's going on with Kyle? Mercedes's voice rose defensively. Albert leaned forward slightly. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that other diners couldn't hear, but every word hit Mercedes like a physical blow. A storage shed. For days. No water. A 6-year-old child asking if he was bad because his mother locked him away while she entertained her boyfriend. Ricky went pale. Mercedes, you told me he was at his grandmother's. Shut up, Ricky. Mercedes's mask was slipping. Albert, you don't understand. I needed space. I needed to think. Kyle was supposed to stay quiet. He was supposed to stay quiet while locked in a shed without water. Albert's voice had gone completely flat while you decided you needed space. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chun approaching their table. Major Nicholson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Kyle is asking for you. Also, there are some people here who need to speak with you. Social services and police. Albert stood. Of course there are. As he walked away, he heard Ricky's voice behind him. Mercedes, what the hell have you done? That guy looks like he could kill someone with his bare hands. Mercedes's reply would haunt Ricky later. Let him try. He's got no proof of anything. Besides, what's he going to do? He's a soldier, not a criminal. She had no idea how wrong she was. Albert Nicholson had spent 12 years learning skills that made the line between soldier and something much darker almost invisible. And she had just given him every reason to cross that line. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. Detective Ellen Bond had seen plenty of domestic situations in her 15 years with Hartford PD, but something about this case felt different. The military father was too calm, too controlled. Most parents in a situation would be screaming, crying, demanding immediate arrests. Major Albert Nicholson sat across from her in the hospital conference room like he was attending a mission briefing. Major, we need to understand the timeline, Detective Bond said, her notepad ready. You've been deployed for how long? 3 months this rotation. I typically deploy for 3 to 4 months, then I'm stateside for 2 months. I've maintained this schedule for 6 years, since Kyle was born. And during your deployments, your wife was Kyle's primary caregiver? Correct. Albert's answers were precise, military crisp. I spoke with Kyle via video call every day at 1800 hours Eastern Time. He was always clean, fed, and happy to see me. Detective Bond made notes. When was your last call with Kyle? 4 days ago. Mercedes said he was sleeping, said he'd been fighting a cold and needed rest. Albert paused. I should have insisted on talking to him. Sir, this isn't your fault, Detective Bond said gently. Can you think of any reason your wife might have struggled with childcare recently? Albert was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Detective, I discovered today that my wife has been involved with another man for 18 months. I suspect Kyle may have discovered this relationship or become inconvenient to it. Do you have proof of this relationship? I saw them together today. She introduced him as someone she's been getting to know. Her words. Albert leaned forward slightly. Detective, I need you to understand something. I've spent 12 years protecting this country from people who harm children. I will not tolerate someone harming my child, regardless of their relationship to him. Detective Bond felt a chill. Sir, I understand your anger, but I'm not angry, Detective. I'm stating a fact. Albert's pale green eyes met hers. I want a full investigation. I want to know everything about what happened to my son. I want to know how long this has been going on. And I want to know exactly who was aware of my son's situation and did nothing to help him. The door opened, and a woman in a business suit entered. Detective Bond? I'm Sandra Hayes from Child Protective Services. I need to speak with Major Nicholson about temporary custody arrangements. As Sandra Hayes explained the legal procedures, Albert listened with the same focused attention he brought to operational briefings. Kyle would remain hospitalized for at least another week. During that time, both parents would be investigated. Mercedes had already been charged with child endangerment, but she'd been released on bail. Where is she staying? Albert asked. I can't share that information, Major, Sandra Hayes replied. But I can tell you that she's not permitted unsupervised contact with Kyle until our investigation is complete. After the officials left, Albert remained in the conference room. He pulled out his personal phone and made a call. Tomas? It's Albert. I need to ask you about your cousin Ricky. Tomas Whalen's voice came through clearly. Ricky? What about him? Wait. Albert, shouldn't you be with Kyle? How is he? He's alive. Tomas, how well do you know Ricky? Pretty well. He runs an auto shop, divorced about 2 years ago. Why are you asking? Albert explained the situation in clinical detail. When he finished, the silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. Albert, Tomas's voice was tight with anger. I had no idea. If I had known he was involved with Mercedes, if I had known about Kyle, Jesus, Albert, what do you need me to do? I need information. Everything you can tell me about Ricky. His habits, his friends, his weaknesses. And Tomas, this stays between us. Of course. Albert, you know I'd do anything for you and Kyle. That kid is like my nephew. I know. That's why I'm calling you instead of handling this myself. What do you mean, handling this yourself? Albert was quiet for a moment. Tomas, we've been through 12 years of operations together. You know what I'm capable of when someone threatens what I protect. Albert, you can't. I can't what? I can't protect my son? I can't ensure that the people who hurt him face consequences. Albert's voice remained steady, but Tomas could hear the ice beneath it. The legal system will give Mercedes probation and counseling. Ricky might get charged as an accessory, might not. Kyle will grow up knowing that the people who hurt him got away with it. Albert, think about Kyle. Think about what you'd be throwing away. I'm thinking about Kyle. I'm thinking about making sure this never happens again. To him, or to any other child. Albert stood and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. Tomas, in our line of work, we eliminate threats. This is a threat to my son. This isn't Afghanistan, Albert. This is Connecticut. There are laws here. Laws that failed to protect a 6-year-old boy from being locked in a shed without water for 4 days. Albert's reflection in the window looked like a stranger. Someone far more dangerous than the man who had kissed his wife goodbye 3 months ago. I'll be in touch. As Albert hung up, he realized that his old life, the life where he trusted the system, where he believed in justice through proper channels, had died the moment he heard Kyle's small voice asking if he'd been bad. Now, there was only the mission: protect Kyle and eliminate the threats to him. Everything else was just details. Chapter 4. Gathering Intelligence. Albert rented a small apartment 3 blocks from Hartford General, telling the landlord he needed temporary housing while his son recovered. The truth was more complex. He needed a base of operations that Mercedes couldn't access or monitor. The apartment was sparse: a single bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a secure laptop that existed outside any official military channels. Albert had learned long ago that some operations required resources that couldn't appear on any government inventory. His first call was to Kyle Dunn, the team's intelligence specialist. "Kyle, I need deep background checks. Personal, financial, digital footprints. 2 targets, Mercedes Nicholson and Ricky Whalen." Albert rattled off social security numbers, birth dates, and known addresses. "Albert, is this official? Because if it's not official. It's personal, and I need it yesterday." Kyle Dunn had served with Albert for 6 years. He knew better than to ask more questions. "Give me 12 hours. I'll send everything to your secure drop." Albert's second call was to Gary Hudson, their logistics expert. "Gary, I need surveillance equipment. Civilian grade, untraceable. Audio, video, tracking devices. How much are we talking about?" "Enough to monitor 2 subjects 24/7 for several weeks." "And Gary?" This conversation never happened. What conversation? By evening, Albert had positioned himself across the street from Ricky's auto shop. The building was a converted warehouse in Hartford's industrial district, the kind of neighborhood where unusual sounds at night wouldn't draw attention. Through military-grade binoculars, Albert observed the routine. Ricky worked alone most of the time, staying open until 8 p.m. He drove a modified Chevy pickup, lived in a second-floor apartment above the shop, and appeared to have no security system beyond standard door locks. More importantly, Mercedes arrived at 6:30 p.m., just as the last customer left. Albert watched through the large bay windows as Mercedes and Ricky embraced. Their body language spoke of a relationship far deeper than the 18 months Mercedes had admitted to. This was comfortable familiarity, the kind that developed over years, not months. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Kyle Dunn. "Package delivered to secure drop. Warning, contents explosive." Albert drove to a storage unit facility where he maintained a personal locker under an alias. Inside, Kyle Dunn had left a tablet loaded with information that made Albert's jaw clench. Mercedes' financial records showed regular cash deposits over the past 3 years. Far more money than her part-time job at a boutique could explain. The amounts coincided perfectly with Albert's deployment schedules. Ricky Whalen's records were even more interesting. Divorced 2 years ago, but the divorce papers cited infidelity as the reason. His ex-wife had filed a restraining order claiming emotional abuse and threatening behavior. More troubling, there were 2 police reports from neighbors complaining about loud arguments and sounds of distress from his previous address. But the most damning evidence was digital. Kyle Dunn had recovered deleted text messages between Mercedes and Ricky dating back 36 months, not 18. The messages painted a picture of a relationship that had begun while Albert was deployed to Syria, had intensified during his subsequent deployments, and had recently become strained. The breaking point appeared to be Kyle himself. Recent messages showed Mercedes complaining that Kyle was becoming a problem, that he was asking too many questions about where she went at night and why Uncle Ricky was at their house so often. Ricky's responses were chilling. "The kid's smart. Maybe too smart. You need to handle this before it becomes our problem." Mercedes' reply: "I know how to handle my son." Albert read that exchange 3 times, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't even abuse. This was attempted murder. His phone rang. "Dr. Chin's number. Major Nicholson? Kyle is awake and asking for you. But I need to warn you, he's been talking to our child psychologist, and some of what he's saying, you need to prepare yourself." Albert drove to the hospital in silence, his mind already shifting from intelligence gathering to operational planning. He'd identified his targets, understood their capabilities and weaknesses, and confirmed the threat they posed to Kyle. Now came the most dangerous part of any mission: execution. In Kyle's room, Albert sat beside his son's bed and listened to things no father should ever hear. Kyle spoke in the careful way children do when they're afraid of getting in trouble, describing months of being locked in closets when Uncle Ricky visited, being told that if he ever told Daddy about the visits, both Mommy and Daddy would go away forever. "She said you wouldn't love me anymore if you knew I was bad," Kyle whispered. "She said the shed was practice, to see if I could be good when you came home." Albert held his son's small hand and made a promise he intended to keep. "Kyle, I will always love you. And I promise you, nobody will ever hurt you again." What he didn't tell Kyle was that keeping that promise would require Albert to become someone else entirely, someone who could ensure that threats to his son were permanently eliminated. Chapter 5. The Trap is Set. Albert's surveillance had revealed a pattern. Every Tuesday night, Mercedes and Ricky drove to a remote cabin Ricky owned in the Litchfield Hills, about an hour from Hartford. The cabin was isolated, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through dense forest, with no neighbors for miles. It was perfect. Albert spent 3 days conducting reconnaissance on the property. Military training had taught him that the best operations appeared completely natural to the targets. Mercedes and Ricky needed to come to the cabin willingly, without suspicion, and they needed to believe they were in complete control of the situation. The solution came from Kyle Dunn's intelligence package. Ricky was facing financial difficulties. His auto shop was 3 months behind on rent, and he owed significant money to several suppliers. More importantly, he'd been making inquiries about selling the cabin. Albert created a buyer. Using an identity he'd established years earlier for off-the-books operations, Albert contacted Ricky as Thomas Blackwood, a cash buyer interested in purchasing the cabin for a weekend retreat. The offer was generous, enough to solve Ricky's immediate financial problems and leave him with a substantial profit. "I can have cash in hand by Friday," Albert told Ricky over the phone, disguising his voice with a slight southern accent. "But I need to see the property Tuesday evening. I know it's unusual timing, but I'm flying back to Atlanta Wednesday morning." Ricky eagerly agreed. They arranged to meet at the cabin at 8 p.m. Tuesday. Albert's plan was elegantly simple. He would arrive at the cabin before Ricky and Mercedes establish control of the situation and then have a conversation. The kind of conversation where certain truths would be revealed, certain confessions would be made, and certain problems would be permanently resolved. On Tuesday afternoon, Albert visited Kyle at the hospital. His son was improving physically, but the psychological damage would take time to heal. Kyle still flinched when nurses approached too quickly, still asked permission before speaking, still apologized for things that weren't his fault. "Daddy, when can I come home?" Kyle asked. "Soon, buddy. Very soon. And when you do come home, it's going to be just you and me. Nobody else will ever hurt you again." Kyle's eyes brightened. "Just us? What about Mommy?" Albert chose his words carefully. "Mommy is going to be going away for a while. But you and I are going to be together, and we're going to be safe." That evening, Albert drove to the cabin in a rented SUV equipped with the surveillance equipment Gary Hudson had procured. He arrived 2 hours early, using the time to prepare the scene. The cabin was a simple 2-room structure with a stone fireplace and minimal furniture. Albert disabled the main circuit breaker, ensuring the only light would come from the fireplace. He positioned cameras in corners where they would capture everything but remain invisible in the dim lighting. Most importantly, he prepared himself mentally for what was about to happen. Albert had killed before, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in places whose names would never appear in official reports. But those have been enemies of the state, terrorists, people who threaten American interests. This was different. This was personal. At 7:45 p.m., Albert heard the rumble of Ricky's pickup truck approaching. He positioned himself in the cabin's small back room, where he could observe and listen without being seen. Mercedes and Ricky entered the cabin, arguing. "I still don't understand why you need to sell this place," Mercedes was saying. "It's perfect for us. Private, secluded. Because I need the money, Ricky snapped. Because your husband's fancy military salary doesn't help me when my business is failing. Albert's military salary? Mercedes laughed bitterly. Albert doesn't know about the money I've been giving you. He thinks I'm saving for Kyle's college fund. Albert's hands clenched. Kyle's college fund. Money he'd saved for his son's future, stolen to support his wife's affair. Well, after tonight, we won't need his money anymore, Ricky said. This buyer is paying cash. Enough to get me out of debt and set us up somewhere new. What about Kyle? Mercedes asked. What about him? The state is investigating. They'll probably place him in foster care or with relatives. Either way, he won't be our problem anymore. Albert stepped out of the back room. No, he said quietly. Kyle won't be your problem anymore. But you've become mine. Chapter 6, Confessions in the Dark. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees when Albert emerged from the shadows. Mercedes gasped, stumbling backward into Ricky, who had gone pale in the dim firelight. Albert, Mercedes's voice cracked. What are you doing here? How did you? Thomas Blackwood, Albert said conversationally, settling into the chair facing them. Amazing what people will believe when you offer them exactly what they need. Ricky needed money. I needed you both in an isolated location. Symbiotic relationship. Ricky reached for his phone. I'm calling the police. No signal, Albert said without moving. I disabled the cell tower about a mile back. Military-grade jamming equipment. Very effective in situations like this. Situations like what? Mercedes demanded, though her bravado was clearly forced. Albert, you're scaring me. Good. Fear is appropriate right now. Albert leaned forward slightly. You should be afraid. Do you know what I am, Mercedes? I mean, really no? You're a soldier. I'm a killer. The words hung in the air like smoke. I've eliminated over 40 targets in the past 12 years. Terrorists, enemy combatants, people who've threatened American interests. I'm very good at making problems disappear. Ricky tried to edge toward the door. Albert's gaze shifted to him, and he froze. Sit down, Ricky. We're going to have a conversation, and you're going to want to be comfortable. Albert, Mercedes said, try to regain control. Whatever you think you know. I know you've been stealing from Kyle's college fund to support your boyfriend for 3 years, Albert said calmly. I know you've been locking my son in closets and sheds to hide your affair. I know you deliberately starved and dehydrated a 6-year-old child because he was inconvenient to your relationship. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a tablet, showing them the recovered text messages. Mercedes's face went white as she read her own words about handling Kyle. That's not. You're taking those out of context, she stammered. Really? What context makes the kid smart? Maybe too smart, an acceptable thing to say about a 6-year-old boy. What context makes I know how to handle my son appropriate when the method is attempted murder? Ricky found his voice. Look, man, I never hurt Kyle. That was all Mercedes. I told her to be careful. You told her to handle the problem, Albert interrupted. Kyle was the problem. A 6-year-old child who asked too many questions about why his mother's boyfriend was in his house. Albert stood and walked to the fireplace, his back to them. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold precision of a mission briefing. Mercedes, you committed child endangerment, child abuse, theft, and attempted murder. Ricky, you were an accessory to all of those crimes, plus you provided the financial motive for escalating the abuse. He turned back to face them. In any civilized society, you would both spend decades in prison. But this isn't a civilized society, he continued. This is a world where child abusers get probation and therapy, where men who help torture children walk free because they didn't personally turn the lock, where a 6-year-old boy grows up knowing his mother tried to kill him and faced no real consequences. Mercedes was crying now. Albert, please. I made mistakes, but I never meant to really hurt him. I just needed space to think. You needed to choose between your son and your boyfriend. Albert's voice cut through her tears like a blade. You chose the boyfriend. You chose to eliminate the child who threatened your affair. He walked closer to them, and both Mercedes and Ricky shrank back. Here's what's going to happen, Albert said. You're going to tell me everything. Every detail of what you did to Kyle, every time you hurt him, every decision you made that led to my son nearly dying in a hospital bed. You're going to confess everything. It's going to be recorded. And if we don't, Ricky asked. Albert smiled. It was the most terrifying expression either of them had ever seen. Then I stopped being a civilized man and start being what I was trained to be. And trust me, you don't want that. The confessions began at 9:17 p.m. and continued for over 2 hours. By the time Albert was finished, he had enough evidence to destroy both of their lives in ways the legal system never could. But evidence was only the beginning of his plan. Chapter 7. The Judgment. By midnight, Albert had recordings that would have destroyed Mercedes and Ricky in any court of law. But Albert wasn't interested in legal justice anymore. The legal system had failed to prevent Kyle's abuse. It would fail to adequately punish it. Albert was implementing a different kind of justice. Here's what happens next, Albert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. Mercedes, you're going to sign over full custody of Kyle to me. You're going to transfer every penny you stole from his college fund back to his account. And you're going to disappear from our lives forever. Albert, I can't. You can and you will. Because the alternative is that these recordings find their way to every social media platform, every local news station, and every employer you might ever hope to work for. You'll be known as the woman who tried to murder her 6-year-old son for a boyfriend. Mercedes was sobbing now, but Albert felt no sympathy. He'd heard Kyle's small voice asking if he'd been bad. Mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Ricky, Albert continued, you're going to confess to the police that you were aware of Kyle's situation and did nothing to help him. You're going to accept whatever charges they file, serve whatever sentence they give you, and you're never going to contact anyone in my family again. And if I refuse? Ricky's voice was barely a whisper. Albert walked to a duffel bag he'd placed in the corner and withdrew items that made both Mercedes and Ricky gasp. Plastic restraints, duct tape, tools that had no innocent explanation. Ricky, I've spent 12 years learning how to make people disappear without a trace. I know how to make deaths look accidental. I know how to dispose of bodies so they're never found. Albert's voice remained conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. Right now, you have a choice. You can accept legal consequences for your actions, or you can face the consequences I'll impose. You're bluffing, Ricky said, but his voice shook. You wouldn't risk Kyle growing up without a father. Albert's smile returned, cold and predatory. Ricky, you helped torture my son. You think I care about legal consequences anymore? You think there's any risk I won't take to ensure Kyle's safety? He picked up one of the tools, a military-issue combat knife with a serrated edge. The only reason you're still breathing is because I want Kyle to know that justice was served legally. But if you force my hand... The threat hung in the air like a death sentence. Mercedes broke first. I'll sign the papers. I'll transfer the money. Just let me see Kyle one more time to say goodbye. No. Albert's response was immediate and final. You lost the right to see Kyle when you locked him in a shed to die. You're going to sign the papers and disappear. If you ever contact Kyle, if you ever try to see him, if you even drive through Hartford again, I will find you. Ricky was hyperventilating. What about the buyer? What about the cabin's sale? There is no buyer. There never was. This was all a setup to get you both here, so we could have this conversation without interruption. Albert pulled out legal documents he'd prepared in advance. Mercedes signed these. Ricky, you're going to call Detective Bond in the morning and schedule a meeting to confess your involvement. As Mercedes signed away her parental rights with shaking hands, Albert felt a cold satisfaction. This wasn't the justice Kyle deserved. That would have required much harsher measures. But it was the justice Albert could give him while still being the father Kyle needed. One last thing, Albert said as they prepared to leave. If either of you ever speaks about what happened here tonight, if you ever try to claim I threatened you or force these confessions, remember this. I have recordings of you admitting to child abuse and attempted murder. I have financial records proving theft. And I have the skills and resources to make your lives very, very unpleasant. He paused, letting that sink in. But more importantly, remember that a 6-year-old boy nearly died because of your choices. Remember that every breath you take from this moment forward is a gift I'm giving you, not something you've earned. As Mercedes and Ricky stumbled out of the cabin and into the night, Albert remained behind to clean up evidence of his presence. In a few hours, he would drive back to Hartford to be with Kyle when he woke up. For the first time in days, Albert felt like he could breathe again. The threats to Kyle had been neutralized. The people who had hurt his son would face consequences. And Kyle would grow up safe, knowing his father had fought for him. The mission was almost complete. Chapter 8, New Beginnings. 3 weeks later, Albert sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Hartford, finalizing the custody transfer that would give him sole legal guardianship of Kyle. Mercedes had signed all the documents without contest and had already left Connecticut for parts unknown. Ricky Whalen had confessed to child endangerment and accessory charges, exactly as Albert had instructed. He'd been sentenced to 18 months in prison and 3 years probation. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Kyle was being discharged from the hospital that afternoon, finally healthy enough to come home. The doctors said his physical recovery was remarkable, but the psychological healing would take time. Albert had already arranged for that healing to take place far from Hartford and its painful memories. The house sale went through yesterday, his lawyer, Kenneth Howard, reported. The buyer paid cash, no inspection, exactly as you specified. And a transfer to the military base in Colorado Springs has been approved. You'll start your new assignment in 6 weeks. Albert nodded. He'd sold the house where Kyle had been abused, using his military connections to arrange a permanent transfer to a base where Mercedes would never think to look for them. Kyle would start fresh in Colorado, with new schools, new friends, and no memories of sheds or dark closets. What about the college fund? Albert asked. Fully restored. Mercedes transferred every penny she'd stolen, plus interest for damages. Kyle's education is secure. As Albert left the lawyer's office, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Albert, I need to see Kyle. Please. I'm his mother. Albert deleted the message without responding. He'd warned Mercedes what would happen if she tried to contact them. Apparently, she decided to test his resolve. That evening, Albert picked Kyle up from the hospital. His son was excited, chattering about the cartoons the nurses had shown him and the ice cream he'd been allowed to eat for lunch. The shadows were still there in Kyle's eyes, but they were fading. Daddy, where are we going to live? Kyle asked as they drove through Hartford. We're going to Colorado, buddy. There are mountains there and snow, and we'll have a new house with a big backyard where you can play. Will Mommy come to Colorado? Albert glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. This was the conversation he'd been dreading, but Kyle deserved the truth, presented in a way a 6-year-old could understand. No, Kyle. Mommy won't be coming with us. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt people they love, and when that happens, they have to face consequences. Mommy made choices that hurt you, so she can't live with us anymore. Kyle was quiet for a moment. Is it because I was bad? No, buddy. You were never bad. You were perfect. Mommy forgot how to take care of you properly, but that was her mistake, not yours. They drove in comfortable silence until Kyle spoke again. Daddy, will you always take care of me? Always, Albert promised. No matter what happens, no matter where we go, I will always protect you and take care of you. That night, they stayed in a hotel near the airport. Their flight to Colorado left in the morning, and Albert wanted Kyle to be well-rested for the journey to their new life. As Kyle slept in the adjoining bed, Albert received another text from Mercedes. I'm at the hospital. They told me Kyle was discharged. Where are you? I have rights. Albert typed a single response. You signed away your rights. Contact us again and face the consequences. His phone remained silent for the rest of the night. At 3 a.m., Albert's secure phone rang. It was Tomas Whalen. Albert, I need to tell you something. Ricky called me from prison. He's scared. He says you threatened to kill him. And Albert's voice was steady. Albert, what really happened at that cabin? Justice happened, Tomas. The kind of justice the legal system couldn't provide. Albert, you can't just... I can't what? Protect my son? Ensure that the people who tortured him face real consequences. Albert looked at Kyle, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. Tomas, your cousin helped abuse a 6-year-old child. Whatever consequences he's facing, he earned them. I know, but there are no buts, Tomas. There are people who protect children, and there are people who hurt them. Choose which side you're on. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Tomas spoke again, his voice was resigned. You know I'd choose Kyle every time. But Albert, promise me you're done. Promise me this is over. Albert watched his son sleep, safe and protected for the first time in months. It's over. As long as Kyle is safe, it's over. But in the back of his mind, Albert knew it would never truly be over. He would spend the rest of his life watching for threats to Kyle, ready to eliminate them with the same cold efficiency he'd shown in Afghanistan. Some missions never ended. Some wars were fought one battle at a time for the rest of your life. Albert Nicholson was prepared for that war. Chapter 9. The Price of Protection. 6 months later, Albert and Kyle were settled into their new life in Colorado Springs. Kyle was attending a small private school where the teachers understood that some children needed extra patience and gentleness. He was making friends, sleeping through the night, and had stopped flinching when adults moved too quickly. Albert had been assigned to a training position at the base, working with new recruits in counterterrorism operations. It was demanding work, but it kept him stateside and available for Kyle's needs. Their new house was a modest 2-story home with mountain views and a large backyard where Kyle had learned to throw a football and was attempting to build the world's most elaborate treehouse. On weekends, they hiked mountain trails and visited air shows at the base. To any observer, they were a perfect father-son team, healing from past trauma and building a bright future together. But Albert knew the truth was more complex. On a Tuesday evening in October, Albert was helping Kyle with homework when his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized but hadn't expected to see again. Albert, it's Detective Bond from Hartford PD. Albert stepped into the kitchen, away from Kyle. Detective, how can I help you? I need to ask you about Mercedes and Ricky Whalen. We found Mercedes' car abandoned at a rest stop outside Albany 3 months ago. She's been missing since then. Albert felt nothing. No surprise, no concern, no guilt. I'm sorry to hear that. Albert, I have to ask, do you know anything about Mercedes' disappearance? Detective, I've been in Colorado for 5 months. I haven't had any contact with Mercedes since she signed the custody papers. Both statements were technically true. What about Ricky? He's serving his sentence, but he's been making claims. Says you threatened him. Says you're dangerous. Ricky Whalen helped torture my 6-year-old son, Albert said calmly. If he feels threatened by the consequences of those actions, that's his problem. Detective Bond was quiet for a moment. Albert, off the record, do you know what happened to Mercedes? Albert looked through the kitchen doorway at Kyle, who was carefully working through a math problem with the concentration of someone who'd learned that getting things right mattered. Detective, Mercedes chose to abandon her son rather than face the consequences of nearly killing him. Some people can't live with what they've done. Some people run away from responsibility. Albert paused. And some people discover that running away doesn't solve anything. Albert, Detective, unless you have evidence that I was involved in whatever happened to Mercedes, I think this conversation is over. I have a son to take care of, and that's my only priority. After hanging up, Albert returned to Kyle's homework. His son looked up with bright eyes that no longer held shadows. Who was that, Daddy? Just someone from work, buddy. Nothing important. That night, after Kyle was asleep, Albert sat on his back porch looking at the stars. His phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number. Package delivered as requested. Client satisfaction guaranteed. Albert deleted the message and destroyed the phone. He'd learned in the military that some operations required resources that couldn't appear on any official record. Some problems required solutions that existed outside legal channels. Mercedes had violated his final warning by attempting to contact Kyle through the school, tried to arrange a chance meeting during a field trip. That had been unacceptable. Albert had spent 12 years learning how to eliminate threats to American security. Protecting Kyle from a woman who tried to murder him had simply required applying those same skills on a personal level. The next morning, Kyle bounded into the kitchen full of excitement about an upcoming school camping trip. As Albert made pancakes and listened to his son's chatter about S-morays and ghost stories, he felt the deep satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. Kyle was safe. The threats had been eliminated. They had a new life in a place where the past couldn't reach them. Some people might call what Albert had done extreme. Some might call it illegal. Some might call it wrong. Albert called it necessary. He'd made a promise to his son. Nobody would ever hurt Kyle again. It was a promise Albert intended to keep, no matter what the cost. In the mountains of Colorado, under endless skies and surrounded by natural beauty, Albert Nicholson had found peace. Not the peace of a man who'd forgiven his enemies, but the peace of a soldier who'd completed his most important mission. Kyle was safe. Kyle was happy. Kyle was loved. Everything else was just details. As Kyle ran outside to build another section of his treehouse, Albert watched through the window and smiled. His son was laughing, playing, being the normal 6-year-old he'd never been allowed to be in Hartford. That laughter was worth any price Albert had paid to secure it, and it was worth any price he'd pay to protect it in the future. Some wars never ended, but some battles could be won so completely that the enemy never rose again. Albert Nicholson had won his war. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.